And we're live. Well, folks, today I have with me Ryan Watson from Upsourced. It's Upsourced Accounting. So we're going to be talking a lot about finances and forecasting, specifically for agencies. Ryan, thanks for coming on the show.
David, thanks for having me, man. This will be fun.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just start by having you tell folks a little bit more about your background, about Upsourced Accounting, just to kind of set the stage and whatnot.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Right. So obviously, I'm Ryan. I'm one of the original founding partners here at Upsource. Like you said, it is an accounting firm. I'll use air quotes only to say that it's a little different than a traditional accounting firm in that we don't really put a lot of emphasis on the traditional compliance function that you would think of from like your CPA. Our focus is exclusively on outsourced accounting and CFO advisory. I often say that we provide services like in two buckets. One bucket is we organize the financial and non-financial data you need to make decisions, right? So that's doing your accounting and your AR and your AP and those sorts of things, as well as some non-financial KPIs. And then we join your leadership team when we sit with you side by side. We help you make those decisions with that data. And that's the CFO advisory. And so we work with, about 120 development and marketing agencies sort of scattered across the country in that capacity. We've been doing it for about 13 years. For me, before my role in this seat, I've been an agency person my whole life. So most recently, I ran a CFO and COO of an influencer marketing and media agency that we grew to 45 million and sold to a public company, and was part of an interactive agency prior to that. So anyway, been on both sides, and I know this forecasting sort of exercise pretty well.
Right on. Well, kind of in that vein, I kind of wanted to launch into my first question, which is, it's agencies famously struggle with feast or famine cycles, right?
Yeah.
Which can lead to cash flow issues. I want to kind of start off with how can agencies kind of use financial forecasting to better prepare for some of those cash flow issues?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's helpful it's a helpful question to kind of create sort of like a baseline understanding of how we think about this topic. So let me first start by drawing a little distinction around some terminology that we use here at Upsourced. And we don't necessarily use the terms exactly how the rest of the world does, but hang with me for a second. So we like to draw a distinction between the idea of creating a budget and creating a forecast. And when I use the term budget, what I'm suggesting or what I'm implying is this is an expected P&L, like an expected income statement based on known and expected activity, right? So what do I mean by that? So known and expected activity might be like for my agency, I have revenue that's booked, signed contracts, projects that I've won, whatever that looks like. I've also got a pipeline and I've got, some expectation of what that pipeline is how that's going to convert and ultimately become revenue, right? If I objectively weight it, right? So I've got line of sight to certain activity. And then I can use, and by the way, that line of sight for some agencies might be like 1 to 2 months. And for other agencies might be significantly longer, 9 to 12 months, just depending on the nature of your arrangements and your contracts and those sorts of things. So anyways, I've got a window of visibility. And then based on that information, I also know what my resources need to be in order to meet that revenue and the costs associated with those things, right? And so those two things form like my budget. This is my view of the world based on as far as the eye can see. And I use that to distinguish against what we call forecast, which is the anticipated P&L from anticipated activity. And so that is looking further beyond the eye can see, where I'm going to create an expected income statement from opportunities and sales activity that don't exist yet, right? These are conversations that haven't occurred, but I think they might, right? And so in that world, and again, this is just us getting more sort of precise than the rest of the world, but we say that we do it this way for a very specific reason. And the reason is because most agencies should not do what we call forecasting, because most agencies don't have a predictable enough revenue generation engine where there's a basis for forming that expectation, right? And so if you don't have that, right, like your projects are coming somewhat chunky, they're coming from non-repeatable means like referrals and organic activity and relationships and those things like that, then we would say, hey, you know what? Let's not try to create a forecast, because all we're going to do, best case, is just create some expectations for ourselves. It's going to shatter our dreams. And worst case, it's going to lull us into this false belief that, hey, because we wrote it down in a spreadsheet, it's going to happen. And so I'm going to hire against it. I'm going to spend against it. And that creates some catastrophic results. So if you don't have a predictable revenue engine, then we say, hey, you know what? We're just going to operate as far as the eye can see. We're just going to we're going to work against what we call our budget. And in both of those cases, regardless, you can still do what you're asking, right? Because then in the world where, let's just say I'm one of those agencies, I've got to work with my budget, then I'm going to make cost and staffing choices based on what I see, right? And so if I'm looking at my budget that has 3 months or 4 months of visibility, and I'm taking, my known work and I'm weighting my pipeline, and I look at that, and then I look at my team, right? And by the way, I take that revenue and I convert it to like expected hours. So, okay, this revenue results in this amount of work roughly. And I compare that to my team, and I come up with like, here's my expected utilization. If that's too low, then I have too many people. And so I need to do something about that now. And that might look like letting out some of my consultants. That might look like letting go of some of my W-2 staff. But the point is, what I have to be doing is continuing to do this budgeting exercise and asking myself, does my current company, does my current team meet my known and expected revenue? Yes or no? And if it doesn't, then I've got to do something about it, right? So anyway, to answer your question, like, it's pretty difficult to predict your way. Like, if you're in a project-based environment, it is going to feast or famine. That is part of it's a bit endemic to the work that we do. And so that's the hardest thing about being an agency owner, is matching supply and demand. And so the most important thing you can do is be very objective about the demand that you have, which is the work, and take immediate action to control the supply, which means hire, fire, add freelancers, reduce freelancers, such that you have an expected profit at every month. And that's the only way to use forecasting to solve that problem. The only other thing, of course, that you can do is increase your cash reserves so that you have some buffer as you have this sort of peaks and troughs.
Yeah, I was going to ask kind of what role your cash reserves would have on this. I've heard people say, "Oh, well, you should have at least 3 months." Some people say more, some people say less, but I imagine that can help at least if you expect there to be highs and lows, seasonality or kind of more macro, economics ups and downs. Having some money in the bank just to kind of help mitigate that.
I mean, my 2 cents on that would be, we often recommend 3 months as a starting point. And if you, I suspect we'll talk about some of this, if you find yourself in a recurring revenue or retainer based arrangement, you can sustain with fewer than 3 months of operating expenses and cash. And if you have a really chunky, a very hard to predict business, you probably need a little bit more than 3 months. But we often are recommending, like, that isn't necessarily to get you through multiple months of losses as much as it's meant to bridge the gap in timing, right? Because I might have a 6-month project that I can only bill in maybe 2 milestones. And so I need my cash reserves to get me from milestone 1 to milestone 2. That's what my cash reserves are meant for. They're not necessarily meant for to get me from month 1 to month X when I'm going to find new work, right? If you're looking at your budget and as far as the eye can see, I don't have any work for the team that I've got, you should not burn your cash reserves to keep looking for work. You're going to have to right size yourself so that you're not earning an expected loss. These situations never materialize more positively than you think. They always end up less positively than you think. So anyway, that's how we think about using cash reserves.
Okay. Well, I guess related to that, there's probably, given all the different agencies that you've worked with, the volume and probably over time as well, you've seen a lot of, I guess, good practices and poor practices. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see agencies make that you would just say, as a low hanging fruit sort of thing, like, here are some things that you need to stop doing, and here's some things you need to start doing, to kind of, I don't know, get your move in more of a healthy direction?
That's a really good question. I mean, yeah, of course, of course, we've seen all iterations. I think I think like if I were to try to answer this as like kind of succinctly or maybe as like neatly as possible, I guess I would say, so this reminds me of another like kind of way of, again, I'm going to refer to like frameworks all the time because we try to use frameworks to make these complicated topics maybe a little less complicated. So one of the frameworks we talk about a lot is what we call the life cycle of agencies. And it's really just meant to sort of acknowledge that as you grow your agency, your size and complexity is going to create different kinds of problems along the way. And the solution to those problems is different along the way. So these things are not static businesses. It's not just like, this is how you are successful as an agency. Like success looks different as your agency kind of moves through the life cycle. And I'd say the biggest mistakes that agencies make are they're applying the wrong operating model, like the wrong playbook for the
Mm,
stage they're in. So for instance, by the way, our life cycle stages are like create mode, build mode, grow mode, scale mode. And create mode is like 0 to 1, 0 to million, 0 to 1 sort of philosophically, 0 to 1 million in revenue. Like they're kind of the same. And like a lot of create mode agencies, I find, are do an activity I call playing business, which is like doing a bunch of things that feel productive and feel like things businesses should do, but honestly don't contribute to the stuff that really matters for them in 0 to 1, which is 80% finding people to buy your service and then finding a way to deliver the service with limited funds. And like
right.
creating a 5-year plan or a business model, or like a business plan or a 5-year model, or trying to trademark a bunch of little marketing things you've done. Like that's a lot of playing business. It feels like, oh, I'm doing stuff, but none of that shit matters. I think another thing that came to mind as you were asking the question, I was kind of picturing like, okay, as agencies are trying to sort of like grow and scale, what's a thing that often trips them up? And again, I think it's just another version of applying the wrong operating model. So another one of these stages that so build mode is what we call like the 1 to 3 million in revenue. And that's basically like, you got, at 1 million, you got here and like, you have a right to exist. Hooray. But you're probably like, wearing 1,000 hats and you have a job more than you have a business and it's not that profitable. And you spend this whole time like getting yourself profitable. And it's working and it feels really good. And then you hit like a brick wall. That's like 3 to 4 million in revenue, and everything that used to feel easy now doesn't feel easy. And you start to lose clients and employees and whatever. And again, it's like an example of, well, you figured out the operating model that worked for that stage. And now at a certain level of complexity that often happens around that 3 to 4 million in revenue, it doesn't work anymore. And it's because your agency got too big to use. Like, your build mode is probably like, you got a bunch of OGs and it's a familial kind of a business. And there's nothing really documented in the way of processes. It's all just kind of second nature to everybody. But then you hire people who weren't an OG and it wasn't second nature. And now there's like 3 or 4 levels of decision making between that one central group that you had and the people doing the work, and it's creating a bottleneck. And the solution to that problem is, okay, the new operating model requires me to make the organization smaller, to create departments or silos, like little individual sort of patches of grass that deputies can now run and be held accountable to. And so anyway, it's just in total, like there's a bunch of these things. And it really always comes down to like, I'm trying to, I mean, even the problem of like, I often see folks try to outsource sales too early. Like I'm at a million
Hmm.
or a million and a half in revenue or 2 million in revenue. It's like, oh, I need to go hire like a CRO or a head of BD so I can, as the owner, get completely out of sales. And I don't know how many times I've seen that and then seen that blow up, because it's just, for a variety of reasons, that's not successful. But that's another version of, you're applying the wrong operating model. That's a scale mode thing that you're trying to do in build mode, and it doesn't work here. And so just kind of recognizing like where you are and what is required for where you are, um, is kind of the answer.
Yeah, that makes sense. So kind of having just being self-aware, I guess, in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, being
Yeah.
like, where am I at? And am I trying to do something just because a larger agency is doing it, or am I doing it because it actually is necessary for what's right in front of me?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, one of the other things I wanted to kind of get at, you had mentioned project-based revenue, kind of can lead,
Yep.
you want to have more money in the cash reserves when you're project-based agency. Retainer-based can smooth out, some of that. And so you can maybe have a shorter window there. Can you talk just a little bit around maybe financial strategy, specifically as it relates to, like, what advice would you give to a dev agency, for example, that is more reliant on project-based work, but maybe they do some retainer like maintenance work? What sort of tips
Yeah.
would you give them?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple thoughts. So first of all, um, the in the world of like types of revenue arrangements, we often kind of distinguish between, like, on the one hand, there's project revenue, and project revenue is tough and bad. And on the other hand, there's recurring revenue or retainers, and that's great. And I agree, like retainers or purely recurring revenue is certainly like the holy grail if you can get there. There's a thousand reasons that everybody already knows why that's advantageous. But by the way, it's not always a perfect fit for just the go-to-market of your agency. Like, it just may not, the things you do may not lend themselves particularly well to a retainer-based arrangement. That's okay. One of the things that we think about is not necessarily the recurring revenue, but the concept of retainable revenue. In other words,
Mhm.
like, if I'm looking at my revenue this year, how much of that revenue came from a customer or a logo I had before this year? If that number is less than 50%, it is going to be very difficult for your agency to reach 4 or 5+ million in revenue. I don't want to say it's impossible, but if I go through my portfolio of clients, I don't have a single one at that size who does not have north of 50% of retainable revenue. And so, again, for project-based agencies in a sort of upper mid-market or enterprise kind of environment, like, that looks like an annuity stream of projects, right? Like, I go into Salesforce and I do, whatever it is, Salesforce Connect. I don't know if that's a real thing, but I do their event, and then I do some, I do an app for this other sort of conference that they're doing, and maybe I'm doing projects. It's like a land and expand kind of a strategy. I'm doing projects for different groups within the company, or I'm doing follow-on projects for the same group. But even though it's not, a contractual recurring agreement, I have a certain amount of revenue that I can try to keep and grow over time. So that's kind of number one. Like, even if you're not in a retainer base, find a way. And again, I think that often looks very possible up market. The only place I've ever really seen that not be successful is, like, if your client is the SMB, you're
Mhm.
probably only going to get one project every decade from those clients. It's just very hard to build a particularly large agency without that. So anyway, that's number one. Number two, then, if you find yourself in project-based revenue, regardless of whether it's retainable in large part or not, again, I think I said this before, like, the big challenge of running an agency is this concept of matching supply and demand, right? Like, the demand is the work that I have, the supply is, my resources to do the work, which is people, right? And
Mhm.
so, when demand is kind of going like this, the only way for me to make money is for supply to kind of go like this. And if you're exclusively full-time employees, having supply go like this is a very disruptive kind of culture, right? Hiring,
Mhm.
firing, that really stinks. So one of the ways you can kind of smooth that out is to rely in part on consultants and freelancers to be your safety valve, right? And so we recommend at least 10% of your service labor to be comprised of freelancers and consultants, maybe meaningfully more, depending on, just how chunky that is. And that allows you to ramp up when you need to ramp up, and to let a little air out of the tires when you need to come down. That doesn't necessarily prevent you from having to hire W-2 or let some folks go if the sort of ups and downs are particularly dramatic. But it definitely creates a little bit of mitigation against some of those things. And then the last thing is you're going to need a little bit more cash on hand because, again, while I don't necessarily recommend funding like losses in between, but again, if you've got project-based work, you're probably going to have really chunky cash flows and you're going to need more money. We also recommend every agency, particularly when they're having a good period, go get a line of credit. Again, do not draw on your line of credit to fund an unprofitable business. Like, do not fund losses with your line of credit. But if you've got an invoice for a milestone that's you're going to send in a month that you're going to collect in 2 months, you need the cash now, you can borrow against that mentally. Like, you should do that.
Yeah.
And that's what the line of credit is for. So that's a couple things. But yeah, that's, I mean, project-based agencies are like the majority of what we work with. And it's that's what makes it tough. But anyway, you're not alone if you find yourself in that world.
For sure. Yeah. Well, maybe kind of to this point, like, say you are a project-based agency.
Yeah.
And you're just trying to kind of take a lot of this financial advice and boil things down to, okay, what are the metrics that I need to be paying attention to, and trying to impact just on a simple level. Like what are the, if you try to boil it down, where do I need to focus as a dev agency owner?
Yes. So, okay. So I've got this, and I might even try to share my screen, David, if this is going to happen. We'll see. We're going to do this on the fly, but I'll do it in a second here. We have, again, here's another framework. I'm sorry, but we do a lot of these. We have another framework. It's called the hierarchy of financial needs. And it's, not coincidentally titled similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, the reason that we created this hierarchy, the point of the hierarchy of financial needs is meant to answer the question, what KPI should I focus on? Or what KPIs should I focus on? And it's in response to, again, we get a bunch of clients who are like, hey, I read this article. Here's the 25 KPIs I should manage for my dev agency or whatever, right? Or here's my dashboard. It's got these 30 things on it. Can you manage this for me or whatever? And I just fundamentally don't believe that's the best way for you to manage your business for a couple reasons. One is yes, there probably are 25 KPIs that we could measure for your agency, but I can promise you those 25 KPIs are not mutually exclusive. Like, they're not independent. And so if your net margin's bad or your gross margin's bad, your net margin's probably bad, your cash on hand is probably bad. Like, so just emotionally seeing a sea of red on your dashboard because all of these interdependent metrics are all going the same direction, that doesn't motivate behavior. That actually makes you just want to put your head in the sand. And so the other reason is like, look, you can only prioritize one thing at a time. And the reality is, like, there probably is only one thing that you should be focused on, or two things that you should be focused on. Because once you have the benefit of like creating a little bit of momentum and just psychologically, okay, I have this one thing and I need to move the ball forward on this one thing. And two, when I conquer that thing, whatever it is, I lift my head and a beautiful thing happens. All these other metrics improve too, right? Because they're all related. And so once I've done one thing, I can lift my head up and look to see, okay, what am I doing next? So for all that reason, we created this framework to say, all right, we think we should only focus on one or two things at a time. Which ones and what times, right? What should I be focusing on when? And so that's the hierarchy of financial needs. I will share my screen. And okay, can you see this, David? This
I can, yeah.
Okay, so this is the hierarchy of financial needs. It's like a little visual that we created for this. And so it's, again, a pyramid, or in this case, a set of stairs, just like Maslow's hierarchy. So in the same way, in Maslow's hierarchy, I can't worry about self-actualization until I have shelter. In the hierarchy of financial needs, I can't worry about predictable revenue growth if I can't make payroll next week. So the way we do it is we start at the bottom and we ask ourselves, do we have a problem here? Have we solved this? Yes or no? If we've solved it, we can step up. If we haven't, that's where we focus. And so, Jen, again, quickly, so the first is just solvency. Like, do I have enough cash on hand to meet payroll next week? Just simple metric. If the answer is no, then we have a crisis, and we have to solve this crisis by finding cash either from past due AR or from personal wealth. Once I've solved my solvency crisis, I now have the ability to look at my P&L and think about, more broad metrics. And the first one on that list is gross margin. So gross margin is just, it's for those who don't know, it's meant to describe like how much money am I making on my core services. So it's revenue less cost of goods sold being the costs required to service the revenue, which is mostly just people, and margin reflected as a percentage. In the world of dev agencies, somewhere between 40 and 50% is generally the target. If I'm not in the target, by the way, that's influenced by a bunch of factors, but if I'm not in the target, then pause everything. I've got to solve for this problem, which, by the way, is either a function of my utilization, as I mentioned before, like I've got a bunch of people whose job it is to deliver revenue. Are they doing projects, or are they sitting around with a bunch of free time? So it's either a utilization problem or a project margin problem. Like, okay, I got work. Am I making any money on that work? Or is my pricing off or my scoping off? So gross margin is like the next step. And once I've tackled gross margin, I can then tackle cash reserves. Cash reserves we've already talked about. We recommend 3 months kind of as a baseline, adjusting up or down based on kind of the cyclicality of my cash collections. And once I've gotten enough cash in the bank, now I can really start to maximize my net profit, like get profitable after. So net profit is, gross margin minus all of my overhead, right? My sales and marketing and my rent and utilities and all that kind of stuff. And that's, and also after my own owner salary. So net profit is measured after paying myself a market salary. And while the gross margin metric kind of fluctuates, net profit really doesn't. 20% is the gold standard. If you're of a certain revenue size, there's really no good reason why you can't earn 20%. And we've got plenty of clients that are well into the 30%. And so once I'm profitable and I'm making money for myself and my partners, then the sort of fifth and final, the capstone, is predictable revenue growth, right? It's that engine of generating leads and closing leads with some degree of sort of repeatability that unlocks my ability to start forecasting, like we talked before, as well as graduate into the next stage in the agency lifecycle. So anyway, so to answer your question, there isn't like one at each stage. The answer is follow the hierarchy of financial needs and ask yourself, have I cleared this? And if I haven't, that's your metric.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think you mentioned this, but there's just kind of like a psychological benefit where instead of it being, here's a whole bunch of things to focus on, it's like, here's the one true north metric that based on the stage that we're at, we're just going to focus on getting that into a good spot and then
Totally,
build from there.
Well, yeah. And again, I mean, some of the creation of this thing was a little selfish and like in a very real world, real human being kind of way. We would have a lot of clients who would come to us who needed help. And then they would sort of like knowingly have a lot of problems, and they would not want to meet with us each month because it would just be bad news, right? It's like, it's just, as a human, it's just easier to ignore the problem, throw the bills in the trash, whatever, than it is to have to sit here and endure like the reality of what's happening. And so by kind of allowing us to look at everything, it became a demotivator and people would just bury their head in the sand. And so we would say like, look, that doesn't do anybody any good. So let's focus on this one metric, right? And if it starts with gross margin, great. And by the way, if you have a gross margin of 32% or whatever it is, well, all we're trying to do next month is move that up. If it goes from 32 to 33, that is cause for celebration. That is not a bummer. We're not going to get lost in the fact that it's not where it needs to be. It's better. We took a step forward, and we're going to take a step forward every month or however often until we've cleared it. And so again, it's a psychological trick. It's the idea of trying to create some sort of momentum so I can feel like, oh, okay, the train's moving. Like this thing's working now. It's an inevitable that we'll eventually get there. And that's kind of what, this is a business is as much of a human psychological game as anything else. And so this is kind of a thing we found that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Yeah, I guess the last big question I had was around, um, I guess, what advice would you give to an agency to kind of help mitigate some of the things that happen in the agency world where somebody's paying late, or somebody wants to put their engagement on pause, or um, you know maybe the scope of a project changes. um,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, these are all like very real realities, right? Um, And so, well, let me address the first. So, in general, there's like a general answer to your question, and I'll come to that second. The one I want to say first is like specifically on our clients like paying late. The very first immediate tactical thing I'm going to do is we're going to have a conversation, and if that's an ongoing client, we are pausing work. The thing you have to realize on collections is your only real leverage is the service you're performing, and so we cannot give up our leverage in a collections exercise by continuing to do work and continuing to do work while we don't get paid. Because what often happens is, oh, well, now we delivered the project and we still haven't gotten paid. And now there's just a lot less incentive for that client to go ahead and pay us. So,
hmm,
we often recommend, like, again, a lot of dev agencies will bill in large milestones. And what we recommend is get as much money as fast as you possibly can. If no other, I mean, in part to sort of like front load the cash, but also to learn whether they are going to pay you. So even if it's a small amount just to get started, that's all you're managing, don't kick off without sending an invoice, because you're gonna wait way too long to find out their capacity and willingness to pay. So anyway,
hmm,
that's just like a small tactical thing. But to answer the
yeah,
broader question, which is like, yeah, look, there's just all these uncertainties, and how do I manage through those? I think it's a lot of the stuff that we talked about. Like, I think, again, the one of the things that I kind of implied but didn't say earlier about this forecasting slash budgeting exercise, depending on where you find yourself in, is a lot of folks, agencies and otherwise, treat them as like annual static exercises. Like, I'm going to create my 2025 budget, and then every month I'm going to kind of evaluate how I did against my 2025 budget. And there's value in that, by the way. Like, not in the budget, but there's value in, if you are an agency that can forecast, creating an expectation of how the year is going to go and comparing yourself to that. If nothing else, then it's a validation or an indictment on your ability to forecast, and you can revise your assumptions and get a little more precise as you go along. So that's helpful. But as a management tool, as a what should I do tomorrow kind of thing, treating it as a static exercise is not the answer at all. Like, this is a dynamic exercise. You should, I mean, if your agency is in a cash crunch, you should probably have like a weekly or more, many times per week view of what is my latest and greatest belief about my expected P&L over my line of sight, whether that's a month, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, however far you can see into the future. I need to ask myself, like, okay, what does the picture look like? What is my expected utilization? Am I expecting to lose money? Am I going to need to let some people off? Am I going to run out of cash? Like, whatever that is. And so if, a project delays or scope changes or whatever, then of course I'm immediately changing that budget or forecast. And I have a new view over what my horizon looks like.
yeah,
And so that absolutely must be done. This is not a one and done kind of a thing. This is again, very frequent exercise. And then obviously, again, we talked about having cash reserves, having a line of credit. All these things help. Again, they shouldn't be used to solve revenue evaporating, but they absolutely can be used to bridge. If you have a client late paying, but it's Procter and Gamble, and you have a ironclad contract, and there's some reason why the IO got delayed, bouncing around, legal, whatever the reason is, fine, right? That's a timing problem, probably not a collectability problem. Line of credit is a perfect solution for that problem. So all those things can help. But I think there's the thing, like, the thing that help you the most is try to get as far away from the unpredictable ups and downs as humanly possible. And again, that looks like, if you can't get to retainers, finding a way to get clients that you can hold on to, maintain, grow, and to do real account planning with. So have real strategic conversations quarterly around what their priorities are, what opportunities exist, where they see your organization fitting in, what you see you could offer their organization based on their priorities, kind of a mutual thing. And that creates a lot, that extends your line of sight. Like that, if you can't, one of the things that we're trying to do is extend our line of sight. And so if I can only see 1 to 3 months into the future, then I'm going to be bobbing up and down in a while. And that's going to be a very stressful business. But if I can have conversations with clients who can give me more insight into where I'm going to be used, and I can get more pipeline further into the future, or certainly, a recurring arrangement, that just creates, takes the stress way down and the ease of running the business way up.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Ryan, I mean, I feel like there's so many nuggets that people could pull out from this that they could apply to their agency. Are there any other questions that maybe you get a lot from clients or potential clients that maybe we haven't talked about that could just be some some additional nuggets of wisdom or advice?
Yeah, hey, that's a good question. Let's see. We did cover a lot of ground, right? So I'm trying to think if there's anything, I guess the last I'll say, and this is top of mind because we, one of the philosophies that we use in helping our agencies run and improve and drive results is the idea of we're going to help you build a sellable agency, regardless of whether or not you are going to or you want to sell it. And we have a boutique M&A practice where on behalf of our clients, we help them acquire smaller agencies if they're looking to, roll up and grow inorganically, or raise their hand and try to get, good offers from qualified buyers if they're looking to potentially sell. So M&A is on my brain right now because I've got a few deals going. So, but also we often get the question of like, what do I need to do differently, in order to sell? And so there's a few things that I can just kind of tick through that can be helpful as you're thinking about, how might you think about what, influences your sellability and what you might do to improve your ability to sell. So let's see. The first would be size. So a thing that we just want to like clarify, be clear about is that the larger you are, the easier it is to sell. And generally speaking, like the 2 million EBITDA. So by the way, in the world of deals or M&A, generally the price is based on, or the ability to buy you is based on EBITDA, which is just kind of a fancier version of profits, profit without certain things like interest and taxes. So EBITDA or profit, let's just say net profit, north of 2 million kind of opens up the more or less the full spectrum of potential buyers, right? Like clients, strategic agencies, financial buyers, individual entrepreneurs, those kinds of folks. Like that's everything. And south of 2 million, you're going to have a subset of those potential buyers. South of 1 million, it's not really even much of a market. That doesn't mean you can't sell. It just means it's going to be really random. The multiples are going to be pretty low. It's just going to be tough. Like it's not that sellable, regardless of whether you've done like a wonderful job building a lot of great things. It's just, there's just a lot of go to zero risk in the eyes of a buyer, and you just need to be a little bit bigger doing some of the same stuff. So that's number one, size. The other being like, my growth, like the consistency of my growth and growth rate. And also that capstone on the hierarchy of financial needs, my growth engine. Like, am I getting revenue from consistent, repeatable sources, or is it just, the network of the founder or, some other kind of random or less predictable things? The more you have, consistent growth with a mechanism for revenue generation, the higher your multiple is going to be on the range of potential outcomes. Profit being the third one. So again, both consistency of profit and absolute amounts of profit. And we talked about the benchmarks a little bit, but you want your gross margin to be, again, depending on your dev agency, could be acceptably as low as 40% and could top out as high as 50%, but somewhere in that range, with net margins pretty non-negotiably north of 20%. That people are going to look for at least 20%. And they're going to want to see consistent profits. Does that mean if you had a down year that it sort of disqualifies you? No, of course not, right? Of course not. But the further back into history the down year was, and the better the narrative or the story around that down year, right? Like we had a global pandemic, so we lost some money. Okay, I can get my head around that as a potential buyer.
Right.
Retainable revenue, we talked about that at length. That's big. So again, it doesn't have to be recurring, but you got to show I have customers. By the way, the corollary to retainable revenue is not too much concentration risk. I don't have customer or, a greater than 25% of revenue coming from customer. I've got customers. And again, put yourself in the mind of a buyer. Like they're buying your team and your revenue. And so if your revenue is all new revenue every month, right? I don't have any retainable revenue. It's just a sort of rotating door. What am I buying? Like, all the stuff you've done before is irrelevant to me. I'm just buying my faith in you to keep doing that. Just does not command a very high multiple. But if I've got good customers that have long-standing history of spending money and a good narrative for why they're going to keep spending money, great. That's what I'm buying. Focus. I've got a couple more. Focus, like your degree to which you're specialized or you have a niche or a specific area. That's not a make or break, but you're going to command a higher multiple the more specialized you are. And lastly, team. So again, remember, what are you buying? If I'm buying a business that is heavily dependent on the founder being extraordinary and wearing many hats and sort of being the rainmaker, it's not a very attractive proposition for me because that founder is going to stay through their earnout and they're going to skedaddle. Then I don't have anything. But if I'm buying an organization where the founder has delegated the work to a high functioning team and that team is operating independently and that team is excited for what's next, now I'm buying a business and I'm going to apply a pretty high multiple to that. So anyway, that would be the things to consider. And depending on your size, sort of derives your multiple ranges. On the low end, 2 times, right? If you're selling below $1 million in profit, you may not be able to get an offer much greater than 2 times your EBITDA, which, to be honest with you, if you're having a good time running your agency, it's not worth it. But the larger you get, north of 2 million EBITDA, now we start looking at multiples that could be as high as 8, 10, 12 times profit. And now this starts to make a little bit of sense. So, and everything in between based on the criteria that we talked about and your size.
Awesome. Oh, that's super helpful. And again, more nuggets of insight.
Got all
and
of
wisdom
them just
there.
all day long. That's all we're doing here.
Just an insight
No,
machine.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
Sweet.
Cool.
Well, thanks again for coming on the show. For people who want to follow up with you, learn more about Upsourced, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Awesome. So you can find us on our website, Upsourced Accounting. It's past tense. Oh, you see it in my title there, upsourcedaccounting.com. You can find us there. We have like a contact form. And then I referenced a bunch of frameworks. All of those come with videos on our YouTube channel at Upsourced is our handle. And subscribe, like, engage, all those things. So
right on.
That's where we're at.
Well, thanks again. And
Yeah.
Looking
Thanks for
forward
having
to
me. This was
maybe we can
fun.
connect again. Yeah, I
Yes,
agree.
sir. We'll do it. All right.
Well, awesome. Thanks so
Happy
much.
Friday.
You too. And